the fact that, a very interesting statement here that was made, that it was the wave of Washington's support in the war against terror that apparently informed our position as a country, and there was apparently exogenous pressure from the Obama administration then for us to deploy our troops to be part of AMISOM in Somalia. Do you believe that statement?
I don't know, Zainab, who you're quoting, but before I comment on that particular statement,
yes,
let me salute the KDF forces for what they did in Somalia. I happened to be on the ground at that time, and I saw it. Kenya came into that war reluctantly in very difficult circumstances, because ordinarily the doctrine of missions of this nature discourage really neighboring states entering that kind of fray. And the consequences of it. I mean, you can see the implications, because our borders are porous, and when you engage in such a situation, it creates a very bad environment. But Kenya to go in. If you recall very well, this was actually the start of our our tourism collapsed, because you were having attacks, whether it was in Mombasa, in Nairobi, and all over. You couldn't even think of going to a restaurant. And so Kenya was actually pushed to the corner, Kenya to go there, initially to protect the borders, infiltration, but eventually, and actually, before Kenya went in, there had been a kind of standoff where the forces, some of them were just staying in Khartoum, not Khartoum, sorry, Mogadishu, the forces that were there, whether it was from Burundi, Uganda, because they didn't have enough capacity. So Kenya went there, and that enabled the forces then to re-energize and start that offensive. Right. And I think my colleagues have talked a lot. The question that is being asked, I'll come back to lastly. So the question that Kenya went in because there was pressure from Obama administration is not correct. Kenya had of necessity to go in, even against that doctrine that I mentioned. But obviously, the Americans have been at the forefront of supporting that, and the Americans have contributed a lot in that, and we should also acknowledge that support. But having said that, the question you asked earlier on, is this war winnable? And I think Mustafa made a very important point. This is not a conventional war. And I fear for the fact that this is one thing I supported Trump when he talked earlier on and he criticized Obama, that you don't announce a date of your departure. Because you know the nature of this asymmetric war. You're fighting an enemy that is not visible. All they do is melt into society and wait for the date. And when you go, they march. So I fear the fact that we just make this publicity that in 2 years we are living and in a situation that is so complicated. You see, one of the primary objectives of the war was to help Somalia establish an effective control of its territory, have a government that is fully
Has that been successfully achieved?
That's the question. We haven't even had elections, proper elections. We're struggling to have proper elections, registration of voters, go to elections, and stabilize that. Have a full force of Somalia armed forces that is in charge, and then also have, the government and parliament and all that in place that is in harmony. We are not quite there.
All right, Ambassador. And finally, Dr. Momo, even on this subject, so remember we went guns blazing in Somalia, but the UN apparently accuses the KDF troops within Somalia of some issues which include illegal charcoal business in Kismayo. So how has that really dampened Kenya's reputation in the region and as a regional power hub?
Yeah, Zainab, the first thing is that that question about, has Kenya won, has Al-Shabaab been defeated and so on, is not anchored on a good premise. It's not about you, but I'm saying that's not how we should think. There's a big picture here. There is something called extremism. Extremism and terrorism are not new things in the world. People have terrorized others. If you read the book we've written and what Dr. Mustafa himself has written and so on, these things are not new. And terrorists were there and so on, and extremists were there. Terrorism is the visual expression of some form of extremism, okay? And what we are fighting is not necessarily just Al-Shabaab, but we are fighting extremism. And that extremism is affected the world and so on. Now, the first place is this. Once you find violent extremists, terrorists with assets in action, the security and survival of states and the life and liberty of citizens is at risk. That one has to be stopped. If terrorists come here now, we will not start asking about this. We will confront them. The state will have to confront them. And that is what Kenya was doing. We had bombs here, grenades here the whole time here, and we had to go to the source. Between 2008, 9 and all that, and they were exploding just here in the bus stop. And people had to go to the source. That was the only way, because that is a direct threat to the supreme national interest, and therefore it has to be stopped. But over and above that, there are deeper things about getting the source of that deeper extremism. And that extremism is what is not just about Somalia, is about many things that are happening around the world. You have even people who are violent extremists right inside the United States, right inside Europe. People who go to the Paris attack. What do you call the other one? Down in Belgium, in Brussels. Now, why am I saying all these things? We shouldn't look at it as a war, but a global effort. And this global effort is to stabilize societies, especially where there are governance spaces. And that is what we are trying to feel in the context of making sure there is a working, functional government by the Somali people inside Somalia. There are 3 spheres of influence there, at least 2, the actual Somali on the ground, and these are the forces of, remember, Al-Shabaab is just a small affiliate of Al-Qaeda and other groups, Dawla al-Islamiyya, fi wa al-Iraq wa al-Sham. And all these are serious. Daesh, they have been defeated in Syria. There is a vacuum, and people are going in to fill that vacuum. How it is done can get people into another war trap that will be murky. And therefore, we have to be careful how we handle these things. These kind of stories about who was doing charcoal and all this, forget about those stories. They don't make sense. We are talking about important things about how we shall stabilize Somalia under AMISOM, under African Union, and the rest of the world.
But here you have Kenya, whose reputation has been put on the spotlight.
No. It is not. Let me wind up. You see, it is not about Kenya's reputation has been put
within the regional hub.
No. We're getting it wrong. That was just one aspect, and there was not any factual evidence pointing to such things. If there were
but you have the United Nations accusing.
Listen, my dear, if there were any aberrations, they have to do with individual. It's not about Kenya. It's not the business of Kenya to sell charcoal in Somalia. It's not the business of KDF.
All right.
So that's what I'm saying. Let's look at the bigger picture and what we want to do to stabilize our region.
All right.
That's what the African Union is saying. That is what AMISOM is saying. And that's what the United Nations Security Council is doing.
All right, Dr. Momo. Hashi.
Well, I'm not so sure. I think that we have a moral obligation with the Kenya Defense Forces and our state, that when we intervened in Somalia to fight terrorism, that we had a mission, and that mission had a system of conduct, rules of engagement. We're not a rogue state. And therefore, our military and our forces, whom all Kenyans love and we support, when they go to places like this, they go as an order of the Commander-in-Chief, and the Commander-in-Chief gives them a set of rules of engagement. When you go there, this is how you're going to conduct yourself.
Correct.
You're not going to conduct yourself in a way that brings dishonor to us. And therefore, it is in the public domain and in the public intellectual property that just as much as there are elements of corruption in many places in this country, there are individuals who have besmirched the good name of the Kenya Defense Forces, and have engaged in some nonsense over there. And those people should obviously will be taken to task by the internal mechanisms of the KDF. And we're going to leave that for the KDF because they know how best to do that. Because we don't want any kind of dishonor. We don't want airplanes bombing camels. We want airplanes that bomb terrorists. So we don't want collateral damage. We don't want people who are around there to just die without any reason. Every state has a responsibility to act in that way.
All right.
Lastly, I also think that it's very important not to associate all these people with, the good name of, just as the KDF has the good name among us, that we should not be Islamophobic. We should be very able to have a distinct analysis of who these political actors who are using terror and the beautiful name of Islam to try and besmirch people.
Correct.
And I think that's a very, very, very important thing, because on the home front, and I've said this before, I remember when the Kenya government was putting all the refugees in stadiums and in cages around the country. And I was called upon to speak on national TV, and I told the government off in no uncertain terms, and I said, this is not going to help us. What you have to do is create a home front, and the home front has to be united. It is made up of many different faiths, many different cultures, but we all act as Kenyans.
Right.
The day that we start peeling away that sense of our Kenyanness and we become divided over these issues, then the terrorists would have won, and that's what they've always wanted. So the message was already sent out,
right.
and the government agreed, and everybody closed ranks, and that's why the terrorists are not exploding anything in Nairobi anymore. Because our intelligence is working, our KDF is working, and our politicians know what to do.
All right, fantastic. And maybe still on this, in Somalia, and some of the developments within the dispute that touches on the maritime issue. So the International Court of Justice has agreed to Kenya's request to delay the public hearing in its maritime boundary case with Somalia to June 2020. But is the ACG an honest arbiter? Owing to the conflict, remember what is happening, or what happened in the South China Sea dispute by China, Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. I'll start with you, Dr. Mustafa. Is ICJ a fair arbiter in this?
Well, ICJ has arbitrated over a number of cases, and they're given verdict. And the result in terms of implementation has been mixed. There are some of those verdicts that have been accepted. A significant number of those verdicts have been stayed on. Nobody, particularly the South China Sea, they don't heed the verdict from ICJ. The question we should be asking is ICJ the right place to go and have this kind of dispute between Kenya and Somalia? And my answer is no, it is not the right place to have the Kenya-Somalia maritime dispute. For the basic reasons, there are so many other alternative mechanisms that would be much more effective and would deliver results. One is the Africa Union border mechanism, AUBM, that we did discuss some times back at our experts symposium that was held by the convened by the Horn Institute. The second bit is direct bilateral negotiations between Kenya and Somalia, which in my view would be the best to actually go. And perhaps now ICJ should go that extra step and refer back Somalia and Kenya to themselves to negotiate. And
of course, that's what President Uhuru Kenyatta had asked. But
that's
of course,
right.
President Farmajo said, no, we want ICJ to be at the arbitrator.
Farmajo is dealing with a very difficult issue here, and I believe that he also would like to see a bilateral negotiation. And because he's a politician and running for election, if he puts that before the Somali community, it's going to be politically suicidal for him to even utter that word of negotiation between Kenya and Somalia. That's
on
right.
the same issue. All right, Dr. Khanenje, your view on the same. What way forward?
Zainab, no amount of court rulings or interventions is going to change the dynamics of a marriage if the marriage is on the rocks. Now, unfortunately for states, you don't have the luxury of divorcing the other person when you can no longer solve the differences that you have. We are, by accident of history and design of geography, we are condemned to be neighbors with Somalia. That is not something that's going to change ever, unless there is a massive earthquake and some earth movement that just pushes us apart, which is unlikely to happen in the next 1 million years. And so, and I want to agree with my colleague here, you know, is the question should be, was the ICJ the appropriate forum? Of course, ICJ can make its ruling, can render its judgment. But the trouble is, if it's not favorable to either party, chances are those parties are not actually going to agree to it. And so we're going to be forced to go back to where the president, and in his wisdom at the United Nations, pleaded, extended a hand of friendship and of neighborliness and of brotherhood, that we should have a bilateral negotiation. We may not be able to do it alone. Perhaps we can get an honest third party to be able to intervene in that. But ultimately, and the only practical way out of this is for the two countries to talk. Now, I understand, and as Dr. Mustafa has alluded to it, Farmajo is also facing a tough time back home. There's an election coming up. And because politicians tend to be opportunists most of the time, if not all of the time, they had made this issue an issue. You know, a lot of times you don't have success that you can run on. And so what you do in international relations, talk about, and diplomacy, that external enmity tends to foster internal amity. So sometimes when you want to unite people in your favor, you have to create this enemy, or at least a subject matter that is external to your own conditions. And so it's not just Farmajo. There are lots of politicians who are riding on to that. So
there's a lot of political dynamic playing around this entire issue.
Exactly, within Somalia itself. And of course, but we also know there are other external interests, I think, which we have presented in one of our studies and we shared on this show, that are at play, that have interest is actually making sure that, well, things are not favorable, at least for the countries in the region, so they can be able to exploit that schism. Now, you know, having said that, one thing I would appeal, and it is good that we've at least, you know, been able to be given an extension, and we hope that within this time some sober minds are going to prevail to realize that it's futile to try and get a solution through the ICJ, especially when something has to do your common shared maritime border, where we can simply be able to set up some joint commission, agree on certain mechanisms as people who've historically, for thousands of years, we've coexisted, you know, together as neighbors and as brothers.
All right. And Hashi, it feels like we've hit a wall, like there's no going forward with this issue. Here you have two countries that have very strong sentiments and very strong backing on the decisions that they've made towards moving forward to achieving a resolution to this.
I think the mentality today, Zainab, if I can say, is the problem that we have in this continent and in this region is the idea of a nation state. Yesterday, or during the Mashvijar Day, the former Prime Minister said something outstanding. He said that we should have a Jumuiya ya Manchi za Nchi za Mashariki, which includes the DRC.
Yeah.
You know, this is a kind of thinking that we need to have, because you know, once you have Somalia and you have Kenya and you have Ethiopia and you have Uganda and you have Tanzania, these are intractable positions. Right? Everybody goes into his own little bunker. So I think that this thing should be mediated by the East African community. This is our home. East Africa is now our home. Nairobi, you walk down the street, you can see all the faces of East Africa. If our good ambassador goes to Malawi here, his language is spoken there. My language is spoken across the border. So what we need is an instruction of how we're going to deal with between Somalia and Kenya. is get the East Africans involved, the AU involved. And before that happens, I think my learned friend on the left is right that we have to start it with a joint commission.
All right.
We have to start it with a multilateral way in which we can get a joint commission to start this.
Right.
And I think even before we go there, I think the government has to name a special envoy. I've said this on the show before, that can go and seek the mind of the leader in Somalia and to see what are the boundaries and where we can go. Because if we make a mistake on this joint commission again, and then this thing goes back to the court, that will not augur well for any of these countries. So the process in which we are going to go through this negotiation is very important, and extremely well-trained technocrats and diplomats and negotiators need to be on the Kenyan team. They need to, we need to have people who are going to tease a solution out of this problem.
All right.
Because if that doesn't happen, Zainab, and this is my last word, is well, there's going to be a maritime bedlam. You know, Somalia got independence before us.
Yes.
Yes, in 1960. So they had an irredentist issue. They were claiming all the borders here from northeast and all the way down to Lamu. And our borders were not really clear-cut. It was a political, economic, and military dispute. So one of the things that we need to do is to settle all these disputes once and for all, so that the jumuiya ya mashariki ikuje, watu waende Somalia wafanye kazi, wa Somalia walete pesa yao hapa, na sisi tuendelee mbele dadangu.
All right, and Ambassador, look at it this way, and this is with regards to the case, of course, that's before ICJ and Kenya's foreign policy as well. Do you think then it mirrors our diplomatic leverage geopolitically and growing the regional rivalry that is already there?
Zainab, courts, the process in court, especially in the model that we have, this nature of litigation, is adversarial.
All right.
So when you come before the court, you already take that extreme positions from each other. And the outcome will always be a loser or a gainer or loss. And that's why I think my colleagues have, adequately articulated the issue that there are mechanisms, that alternative mechanisms that are preferred. In fact, if we go to the charter itself that establishes ICJ, under that it even says alternative preferred alternative mechanisms to the court itself, because of the adversarial nature of the court. And so, having said that, I think this is where we should really give support to the efforts of President Uhuru Kenyatta. You saw at the UN, he made quite frantic efforts to try and bring President Famacho. They even had a meeting with President El Sisi to try and harmonize their positions. And as they have said, when you are in an election mode, it's so difficult for a country to take a position on a serious matter like this. Hopefully, if this election in Somalia gets out of the way, then we can have a good environment that we can sit and look at all this, whether it's AU framework, East African community framework, or joint efforts, as has been said, commission, that should solve this matter. But otherwise, I mean, going to go to court, it is going to really now put us into that direct confrontation for a long time to come.
All right, Dr. Momo.
Yes, Zainab, I think what everyone is saying is that when you take things to litigation theaters, they end up with a win-lose situation. And mostly the enforcement of such outcomes needs a lot of commitment and needs a lot of people so that people don't renege on concessions they have made, because it's a straitjacket approach. But I think what the world is saying and what President Uhuru was saying, and I think the entire region would love Kenya and Somalia to be given their space as neighbors. You can't wish away your neighbor. Sit down and negotiate this stuff. And what Hashi was pointing to, a commission and that kind of thing. The ICJ has ruled over, there are over 500 disputes in the world over territory and all manner of things. And they are not new. And there will still be others to come. The best way is for neighbors to sit down and look out in terms of their, you know, their gain potential of working together, the utility of the expected utility that is common of working together. And those are things that experts have pointed to. We have spoken about these, a very nice article by Professor Makumi Mwagiru on that kind of thing. And that is where everyone is looking, and we know that will work out and this dispute will be resolved.
All right.
But more importantly, one thing, I think this is something that Hashi said, and I would like to underscore it. When you talk about terrorism or extremism, people should not confuse it with Islamist terrorism. These Islamists, there's a difference. We don't say Islamic anymore, we say Islamist jihadist. You see? Like when you say Jamaatul Halis, Lidawat wal Jihad, those are just extremist groups. Now, you have other forms of extremism, white supremacy extremists, Buddhist extremists. If today I tell you all these bad people are doing corruption in this Kenya and all that, they just become good Buddhists.
Right.
We'll be very happy. So, but they are Buddhist extremists. Do you know what they do? They chase Muslims down there, Rohingya, and persecute them and terrorize them. And these things happen in other places, people just terrorizing others and so on. And therefore, it is not about, of course, there is a little bit of meat that is the Islamist, but terrorism and extremism is a broader concept. It's very important for people to understand
that.
Yeah.
All right. And maybe just as we move forward, let's just head to Djibouti for a moment there.
Yes.
So then we have
good.
the bid there, and we have Kenya and we have Djibouti all vying for that position for the United Nations Security in the United Nations Security Council. I know, Hashi, you are itching to talk about
Yes,
that.
I'm
All right.
itching to talk about it. I cede my to the good prof.
No, please,
Dr.
go,
Thank you very
Hashi.
much.
You open the conversation.
We'll speak after you.
We'll react
I
to it.
think I just want to put Djibouti on notice. The reason why we have to put them on notice, and the reason is, you know, we went over there to the Africa Hall in Ethiopia. You know, our expert is right here on the AU. And, you know, we went for the vote. We said, you know, who do you want? Do you want us or do you want Djibouti? And most of the other nations in Africa said, we want Kenya. So Djibouti, you know, is not is playing this gambling game that's not good. So it wants to go to the UN and then say, oh, we're still going to compete for this position. This is not good politics for Djibouti. And we don't think that the language in which I've heard the ambassador here in Nairobi from Djibouti speak on radio, on television, on ethnic television, and the kind of verbiage that he used. If I was Mama Juma there at the Foreign Office, I would have called him up and gave him a dress down. Diplomats in this country have to be very careful about what they say. We can have a debate about those things, but they have to be very careful. Second of all, you know, we have the ambassador, the foreign minister is trying to get us that seat in the UN. It's going to be a tough ride. It's not going to be easy. So we have to understand as the African Union that once we make a decision in the Union, that's the decision that we all have to stand by. You know, you have to make that. That has to be a basic line. And we won that fairly and squarely, and I think Djibouti is doing something that's not good. It's in the IGAD, it's in the African Union, it's not acting in a brotherly spirit. It accused us of trying to go and use the UN Security Council then to go and oppress or cause problems for Somalia, which is obviously not true, and you cannot do that in the Security Council because the 5 permanent members are there, and you know how that system works. So I would like to say that it's important for Djibouti to learn the game of diplomacy in this region, and that it has to be based on IGAD, it has to be based on the AU, and it has to be based on relationships of fair competition, because tomorrow Djibouti is going to be elected for something, and we're going to support them.
Considering that Djibouti has marshaled support in New York, has the guaranteed support of France, Russia, and the US, which, by the way, is a permanent members of the UNSC, and the Organization of Islamic Council, which has 58 member blocks.
Yes, of course. You know, the overriding and supreme spirit in this continent is the African Union. It's based on its Pan-African ideals. We separate our church and our state, and we're not interested in looking for religious support. I think that it's really important for our foreign office, and there's hiccups, and there's these hiccups, and every time I see these hiccups, it's important that we point them out. I think that it's important for us to fight for that seat, because if we don't get that seat and Djibouti beats us to that seat, I mean, that's going to really look really bad. It's going to look really bad.
It's going to hurt. Is it?
It, of course, certainly, and more so because Djibouti is a case of an entitled, jealous little brother who is always jealous of his brother's success. And not to diminish Djibouti, because it's a sovereign country of extremely proud people.
Yeah.
But, the truth is, I think Djibouti needs to move beyond this. Now, what Kenyans might not know, it was not easy, first of all, to get the endorsement of the AU. The Foreign Office and the President have done a lot of work diplomatically to actually try. Yeah. We knew all those dynamics, that it was a member of OIC, it was a member of the Francophone, which you left out. Of course, and France, the United States, and China, they all have bases there. This is something we are very aware of. And of course, the dynamics. Now, I don't know where they have guaranteed support. Yeah. Okay, because countries don't really announce that mostly.
Until the last moment.
Ambassador may share with us, but they don't exactly announce. So that could be speculation by sometimes journalists. Yes, but this is something we should actually, Kenya was also a candidate to host IGAD, but we decided, we're going to support you to actually have that. We would, otherwise, Nairobi was the most ideal place for an organization such as IGAD headquarters. Why is it in Djibouti? Like, who really goes there? I'm not really diminishing it, but just in terms of global diplomacy and relevance, Nairobi was more appropriate, or perhaps even Addis Ababa. But guess what? We decided we're going to support our little brother to do this. Now, we understand what has been going on in the campaign, in spite of the tradition being that a country that is endorsed by the African Union generally is the one that is supposed to get the Security Council, non-permanent member of Security Council. But now we're seeing something that is a little bit unorthodox, a little bit untraditional, almost like bad behavior, frankly speaking.
True.
Of now Djibouti just moving ahead to again challenge Kenya further. Now, that is not going to build the kind of relationship we hope to have in the region, in the Horn region in particular, and even within the African Union, because it's going to increase the kind of schism and that exists, within the continent, and then just try to play one party against the other. It's not healthy for the AU. It's not good for Djibouti, because ultimately, at the end of the day, and especially when you lose and people tend to run away from you, they start seeing you as a troublemaker. It's actually not good for its own foreign policy, for its own standing. They should just stand down, talk to Kenya and say, we're going to support Kenya for this. And again, I'm not diminishing Djibouti, because it's a proud country, it has a long history, but they should adopt the spirit of Pan-Africanism and support Kenya's cause to get the non-permanency in the United Nations Security Council.
Fantastic. And Dr. Mustafa, your view on the same?
Yeah, it's not wise for Djibouti to actually continue the run and challenge Kenya for that particular seat. In the wisdom of the majority of the members of the Africa Union, I think 37 members who voted to endorse Kenya, I think Djibouti should respect that position, especially now that Djibouti participated in that election and got about 13 or was it 12 votes. No doubt, Djibouti geopolitically, its location with China, Russia, and the United States of America having their military camps in Djibouti, they might want to position a weaker state who can do their bidding at the United Nations Security Council. And maybe Djibouti is banking on that, together with, apart from being a part of the Organization of Islamic Conference, OIC, the Arab League, and the Francophonie grouping within the African states. Even a number of those countries that belong to the Francophonie bloc actually voted for Kenya at the Africa Union. And I think it's just fair that Djibouti drop this bid.
The bid.
At this moment in Africa, where there are so many troubles, you need a far much stronger, influential country from Africa at the United Nations Security Council, and Kenya is that country.
All right. And Ambassador, even before you give your comment on the same, Mahad Dirie, who's the CEO of the American Institute of East Africa and also a foreign policy, writes a lot about foreign policy issues, said this, and I'll quote this. He says, Djibouti's argument for the bid has focused on how the AU's nomination of Kenya was not only unprecedented, but overstepped existing principles of rotation. It is the process that is in question here, not Kenya. As he argues, that is, Mahad argues that the principles of rotation used by many international organizations should have considered to determine bids. These principles rely on two major criteria: recency and frequency of service of the UNSC. Both criteria apparently support Djibouti's bid, but not Kenya's.
Thank you very much, Zainab, for asking that question. In fact, before you came to me, and in agreement with what my colleagues have said, I was going to say, let me think outside the box, because the art of competition is also to know the weapons of your competitor. And there are a number of forces in play in this issue. And I have interacted with some of the African countries that are supporting Djibouti, and they cite the kind of things that you've just read. As indeed it has been said, even at the AU, it was so difficult for Kenya to secure that. They had to go to a second vote, and Djibouti was fronting those kind of arguments. And I think Mustafa said something very important, that Djibouti is exploiting its locational advantage, because the Horn of Africa is now the center. In fact, if you look at the global concentration of forces globally, they are concentrated on that stretch there. And the Djibouti is host of that, and is part of the revenue comes from hosting some of those forces in Djibouti. And so we are in a very difficult situation, and I think we should be prepared as we go forward to develop counter-arguments that will persuade those who are going to vote, because at the General Assembly you need 2/3 to win that election. And for that 2/3, I don't think it's all the deal is cut yet, no, but you still need to have very aggressive momentum, because you know, being a member of the Security Council carries with it a lot of clout, and the countries who sit there, you see the superpowers trying to rally them, and I think this is what Mustafa is alluding to make sure that they get allies who think in their line to occupy that seat, because then it makes the work of the General Assembly, Security Council easier in deciding matters that are before them. So here are some of the arguments Djibouti is going to say. Kenya has occupied that position before. Djibouti hasn't. We should develop a narrative.
So the issue of rotation.
Then the second one, there is the tradition within Africa that you have this tradition. But I think, in all honesty, when Africa has decided that here is a candidate from Africa, which means now that 54 countries should be enjoined to support the decision that has been taken in Addis.
Absolutely.
Djibouti going against this grain spoils that. And I think this is where bilateral, negotiations should kick in. Kenya should really try to talk to Djibouti and avoid the situation that the contest is lost on the floor of election, that the country withdraws, but then underneath you then have give and take. Kenya, for instance, Djibouti has been arguing that there was a time they should have been in the Security Council. They left Rwanda to be there. And we should develop that argument and then say that next time it comes, Kenya should, so that we avoid Africa being divided, because the rest of the world would want to see a divided Africa.
All right. And Dr. Momo, you have the final word on this topic.
One thing we must realize is that, of course, competition is natural. It happens. Countries are out there to meet their national interests and so on. But there's a place where these interests are at confluence. And this confluence is pointing to the AU pushing for Kenya and vouching for Kenya. And I think it is not for us to, chest thump or anything, but just to assure Djibouti that in the context of reciprocity. We will be able to support them in many other things, and so are the countries that member states that are going to be in the General Assembly, that Kenya and Africa is going to be able to lobby and work towards platforms and areas of engagement that will better the human condition and security in the international system for the betterment of all. And therefore, there are many other platforms which we can look to and appeal to, and I know Kenya is doing that, and so is Djibouti also doing her whatever. But all the same, we would love to, convince our partners beyond Africa, in North Europe, Western Europe, North America, Eastern Europe, the Asia and Asia Pacific, and Latin America, and so on, that Africa has endorsed Kenya. They should reciprocate in that manner, and we will have many other engagements where we can cooperate, because the point, they talk about the Pareto optimal, the place where all interests sort of converge in terms of or in a favorable manner. I think purposive compromise is to the interest that Kenya becomes an unpermanent member of the UN Security Council, and that is for the betterment of everyone, including those countries that have bases in Djibouti, and we can work with them, and we have made the commitment, and we pray that they support us.
All right, fantastic. And on that note, let's just talk about a little bit of what is happening within the Sudan. Let's call it the Sudan Revolution. So the people of Sudan have won that particular revolution. But the question is, did they learn the lessons from Egypt in preventing a military hijacking of that particular revolution? Dr. Kanenje.
Well, first of all, they did not have the power to prevent the military from doing that. Now, part of it has to do with its history. The military has played a very central role in Sudanese politics, pretty much since independence, and more so during al-Bashir's era. He was a military man himself. And in such situations, change tends to be gradual. The transition is difficult. And the kind of arrangement, transition arrangement that exists right now, perhaps it may just be what they need to be able to transition away. Remember, power never sits willingly, and the military takes time. There are not many times you're going to have the Obasanjos of the world where you assume power, then you decide, you're going to become a civilian. And even in Nigeria, when it became impossible for the military to rule, that's when they decided under Abdul Salam Abubakar that they were actually going to cede, power to the civilian government. But at that time, there are also certain safety nets that have been created, so they're not afraid of, for instance, being persecuted, prosecuted, when the civilian government takes power. Right. But there were no serious institutions that were built in the last 30 years in Sudan that could actually provide an alternative government. They were so weak. This civil society was extremely weak. There was no alternative government in waiting. And so this has to be a learning moment and transition, and what they need is help, but to make sure they don't develop the appetite of staying there. And so if the world and the region pays attention to that and encourages them with appropriate incentives, carrots and sticks, that everybody has to stick to this. If you do not, just know the AU will not accept you, the United Nations will not accept you, and these are going to be sanctions. But then the civilian population or section of the government also has to be prepared and build its own capacity to rule. That is one thing sometimes we forget. You just think once you get rid of the military, things are going to be good. I can promise you, you can get rid of them today, all of them, and then there's civil war tomorrow. Yeah, so it has to be a managed transition with regional and international support, including opening up some pockets to actually help Sudan rebuild its own economy. Perhaps get them off the list of state sponsors of terror to be able to access certain capital. I think that's going to go a long way in rebuilding Sudan.
All right. And Dr. Mustafa, your thoughts on that? And of course, just taking a look at exactly what was happening, the anti-Bashir protests that were happening was impacted by very basic things. For example, the price of bread, like you remember. Are we likely going to witness sort of like an economic revolution across the continent?
Yeah, Zainab, transitions are very difficult, particularly in states such as Sudan, where institutions other than that of military were not built, were not reinforced, were not developed. It becomes then very difficult to see the kind of transformations from a dictatorship to democracy. Sudan has done actually very well up to this point, even though we still see the military creeping in and trying to still exert its power. There are interests obviously to be protected by the military. It's better that the transition is peaceful, even though you can some of those interests are accommodated, as long as they will be dealt with slowly and be done away with. It's better than having a Libya kind of a situation where, well, first of all, in Libya there wasn't even the military developed by Gaddafi. There were no political institutions developed, and unfortunately, a rich country we just went down the drain. There were much more than the internal dynamics. Of course, there were external dynamics from the West, from Resolution 1973 being extended from protecting people of Benghazi to that of regime change that really messed Libya. Sudan should learn from that. Now, what the current Prime Minister need to do and should do is a matter of urgency and to ask the Africa Union, the Western partners, is to remove this tag of Sudan as a terrorist or state sponsor of terrorism. They need to access funds that are going to inject or to ignite the economic conditions in Sudan. It's been on the economy of Sudan has really gone down, and the people, if they will go back to the streets, it's because of butter and bread, as they started with that in the first case. The IMF and the World Bank will need to support Sudan, not to become a basket case, as countries such as Syria and Libya has been with the Arab Spring that has been there before. We all should be supporting Sudan and the Sudanese people.
All right, Hashi.
There is an existential crisis, maybe around the world and even in this continent. Conservative militarists do not want the idea of popular national revolutions in Africa to take place. The Gulf countries are the ones who are pumping money into the military in Sudan to stop ordinary people from changing their government to government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And these are just facts that at the 21st century that we ought to speak about, because it is important to know that South Sudan, the revolution in Sudan, happened because the pipes where the oil was coming from South Sudan there was a civil war in South Sudan, and what was causing the economic miracle in the north was the amount of money they were taking from the deal that they had made between the south and the north. So the problem of the people of Sudan is the problem of Sudan. You know, it's the problem of having an independent South Sudan and not one Sudan. And it now shows that if you declare national self-determination, your little tribes in that self-determinations are also going to fight. So it is better for us to be in a multicultural, larger nation state than to be in a smaller tribal state, because you're not going to solve your problems of justice and equity because you've decided you're utajitenga na wenzako. I also think that it is important that we point out that the military in Sudan for the last 30 years has just been shooting people. They have not really been helping people. And there's a 2-year transition to civilian rule. I think the civilian population in Sudan is going to win. It's going to win in Guinea, where the Conte is trying to look for a third term. The same issues are with us for the last 50 years in this country. Which way forward? And that way forward is constitutional government and democratic government.
All right, Ambassador.
I think we should distinguish one thing here, and just building on what has been said. What the rallies, the central demand of the rallies that have taken place in the recent past are demanding the dissolution of the party, the political party. And I think here we should really say that the people know exactly how they are going down the road, because the military has played a very positive role. They would have listened to Bashir and shoot all those people and just occupy the seat, but they refused, which means they have been a positive factor in bringing about what is now existing. But I think the people now want to delete that political wing of the military, so that the military remain professional and do the job they're supposed to be doing, and leave the politicians, having established the civilian administration. By the way, I know Abdar Hamdok very well, the Prime Minister, an ex-banker. He was my counterpart at in Addis Ababa at ECA, and I think he's a very
briefly,
cool
Ambassador.
Yes, and I think what he needs now support is really how to bring about the economy.
All right.
Because if the economy is not kicking, the people will be tired and they will still go back to the streets, and also to bring about justice, especially closure to some of those that have been killed in the process.
All right, thank you so much. And Dr. Momo, very briefly as well.
Yes, in 1979, a lady called Theda Skocpol was writing in Harvard, and she wrote about social revolutions. Political change and social change does not take place in that kind of Arab Spring. That Arab Spring is not a good thing, and that kind of euphoria of trying to change things not a good thing. It doesn't change societies. It can leave a bad vacuum, and if not well handled, you end up with Libya and all these problems we have. What we are talking about is change that is well calculated and is supported by institutions. This lady said, you know, what makes that change to sustain? The kind of regime was there, the state of the economy, the state of institutions. You need a recipe to make change to be sustainable. If it is done like that, systems rarely change radically. So we have to be careful how we handle that now. Don't condemn the military like that. At the same time, don't urge on people who don't even have institutions. It needs a good balance to win out Sudan into a more stable system that can handle that change.